Folks, it's Thursday, January 12th. Welcome to another episode of The Recovering Liberal, a title I continue to regret, but that's what happens when on a whim you just roll with a joke that a friend makes and uh, forget what kind of automatic perceptions that's going to give people about what your podcast is. No, I'm not a Trump for life person. I'm not a MAGA person. In case you're wondering, I'm just an independent free thinker, and I think that's a beautiful thing. And today, before I touch quickly on the latest in the ongoing telenovela that is the Twitter files and what we're continuing to learn about intelligence agencies and industry and government involvement in content moderation, I want to step back and take a look at some context through a real life, I guess, case study, if you will, but it's really the more overarching industry that is the medical device industry. So right there, the twin of big pharma is medical device. It's an over $300 billion per year industry. So they make a few bucks here and there. And medical devices are, the prevalence of people in our country who are equipped with some sort of medical device, from joints to mesh to birth control devices. I mean, you name it. There's a lot of it, and so I think understanding this stuff is important just in a practical sense. But I more so want to, if you've listened to any of this podcast, you know that I'm a fan of context, because I think it's easy to get kind of caught up in the weeds of whatever is going on today, and kind of neglect to remember historical context that we have and track records of these companies and regulatory agencies and governments that we're currently taking on their word all of a sudden. And in our rush, I think, to be part of, get the next new shiny big thing in the medical world, I think it's kind of healthy, in my opinion, to step back and look at what is our track record with the new next shiny thing and adopting that so quickly. And so if you hear any kind of, I'm going to kind of take a step back and look at the medical device industry and some case studies, and kind of use that as a way to kind of help you understand how this industry, the FDA approval process, how it trickles down to physicians and ultimately to us as patients, kind of understanding all these pieces of how things work. If you hear any similarities to some things that are happening currently, that's on you. I don't know what you're talking about. Um, I would argue, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately, that, there's a rush to call people who bring up valid points, that they're, pokey hesitant. You know what I mean? And I think that for my personal self, I'll just say for me, when I'm making any kind of medical decision, whether it's about any current shiny new interventions or not, I think a healthy amount of hesitancy is great personally, because I'll hopefully give you a peek behind the curtain, and hopefully you'll walk away with, if nothing else, a sense that ultimately nobody is going to do a really individualized, thorough risk benefit analysis than you. It's a process I would go through with a physician whom you trust. I've had some great physicians. I've been really lucky in that way in the past, and I've had some less than stellar experiences like anyone else. This is by no means going to be a knock on physicians, just as a spoiler alert, because I think that many doctors and scientists are trying to really do great work. And I think a lot of times they do, but I think, as I'll demonstrate, even their ability to make decisions on your behalf is somewhat limited. And the way our system at large is structured, it would behoove you, as an end consumer and a patient, somebody with this thing in your body or taking this pill down your throat, it would behoove you to do your own research. And I hope that I'm going to give you some tips today on what I mean by do your own research, and then talk about that with your physician. I'm not giving medical advice. I'm just trying to tell you what kind of the thought process that I go through personally right now, and take a step back and tell you why I kind of go about things this way. because I've learned a few things. I just watched a documentary last night called The Bleeding Edge. Netflix recommended it to me, and my suggestions have no idea why. They must just know me really well. I thought it was a new documentary until I got about 10 minutes in, and I was like, I think this was produced a few years ago. And it was produced in 2018. So it is not brand new. I'm just late to the game and I'm just now watching it. And The Bleeding Edge kind of demonstrates ultimately several things. So, number one, and I'll talk about the stories and the specific devices that they cover. So, one is how much easier it is than, and I'm talking about kind of misconceptions I had, and I think a lot of the public has. So, how much easier it is to get products onto the market in the medical world than it is to take risky, ineffective products off of the market. You would be shocked. The shoddy FDA approval process and just poor regulatory process and structures in place to, especially once something's out there and on the market, just how hard it is really. I had this perception in my mind that even if the FDA approves something, like surely if there's enough adverse experiences with that, whether it's, a food ingredient or a drug or a medical device, surely there's some kind of process in place to be like, okay, let's walk this back a little bit or at least add some new warning labels. No, there's a pretty, well-oiled process to get something out there. Not so well-oiled, to say the least, to walk it back. This documentary I also walked away with, to assume that your doctor knows all about the benefits and risks is to assume a little bit too much. Physicians, I think, are, I'll talk a little bit more about the role that they play. And I'm speaking generally. I know that there are physicians out there who could tell you, soup to nuts. I can tell you all about the FDA approval process that this drug went through. I can tell you all about the risks. I can tell you all about, how many times I've used it, how many times it's gone awry. So there are a lot of physicians out there, I'm sure, who know more than other physicians do about what's ultimately pitched to them by a sales rep from these companies, who obviously have a certain interest in getting the doctor to use their stuff. I walked away with how innovation lacking the drug and device industry really is. We hear innovation, innovation, innovation. Regulations are just stifling innovation. Like we have this perception that we're fed that we need these companies to continually innovate because they're saving lives. And when they're talking innovation, it is almost always, and that's no exaggeration, a piggyback off of previous existing treatments. In particular, when those existing treatments aren't making enough money anymore. Okay. The rinse and repeat cycle in big pharma and in medical devices to rush to market, you hoard a little bit away for the lawsuits you're inevitably going to get because this product sucks. And then you still walk away billions richer, rinse, repeat. We've seen that over and over and over. I cannot emphasize that enough. So the rush to believe when a big pharma or a big medical device company says this is safe and effective, the rush to believe that, I can't understand, because history has repeated itself so many times. And even after the most scandalous, the most provocative stories have come out about these $billion settlements that they've reached for all of the people that their stuff has harmed, they've still walked away so much richer. And so, I watched something recently, and they were talking about the counterfeit community, and this police officer was saying, yeah, we arrested 6 people, but I mean, they're going to do a few days in jail and make 200 grand. Like, for them, it's like, yeah, I'm going to go out and keep doing the same thing. I'm willing to spend a few days in jail if I'm going to make 200 grand. It's kind of like that with these companies and with this industry. They know that they're going to walk away richer anyways. What's like the millions in settlements they pay, it's like pennies. It's a drop in the bucket. I'm also going to talk about how government and regulatory agencies have become totally captured by these industries. And then ultimately how also the patients and the public get continually gaslit by them. And just the utter dismissal of horrific adverse reactions to some of these products. So the documentary talks about, first is a Bayer product called Assure. It was, and I say was because they finally took it off the market magically a week before this documentary was released. And Bayer insisted it wasn't because of, this was strictly for business reasons. It had already, because of the adverse events, been pulled in other countries. Those countries, their equivalent of the FDA, when they started hearing from their public these concerns, those countries, regulatory agencies did the right thing, and they went back to Bayer and they said, give us more safety studies. And Bayer said, oh, actually, we're going to just pull it off the market for business reasons. There's not enough demand anymore. It's kind of like, when you try to walk in with, a stolen credit card to Walmart and pay for something, and they're like, yeah, what's your PIN? And you're like, I'm just going to take this with me and go across the street and shop somewhere else. That's what Bayer did. So they exited those companies. It was still available in the US. And I will back up and tell you more about what happened with Assure. But in the US, they were still allowed to sell the product. Our FDA did not do what these other countries' regulatory agencies did. And so they continued to sell it. And then a week before the documentary came out, they said, the allegations in these documentary are completely untrue. And we're just pulling it off the market for business reasons. It's just, there's just not enough demand, and, we're just going to pull it off of our own volition. So, they talk about Assure. They talk about metal on metal hip replacements and the resulting, in some cases, cobalt poisoning. One of the men featured in the documentary happens to be an orthopedic surgeon himself. And so he did these types of surgeries and got a hip replacement himself. And he ended up getting cobalt poisoning. They found that these metal on metal replacements can leak. And what it looked like was dementia. It looked like he had lost his damn mind, literally lost his damn mind. You can watch the documentary for details of his story. But they went in and redid the hip. His symptoms cleared up in about a month. And so you can imagine all of the people getting metal on metal hip replacements, especially with the aging population that tends to get those, where there was a bigger issue too of things being misdiagnosed as dementia. Then they also talk about two more devices. They talk about the Da Vinci robot, which is, physicians doing robot surgery, and in this case, to do hysterectomies for women. And then they talk about vaginal mesh, so a J&J product. This vaginal mesh, in my mind, I had mesh, like I imagine something gauzy. No, this is like, the surgical mesh is like pretty hard, like plasticky kind of texture. And so I'll hit a little bit on what that was about. But so most research, just as an FYI, in medical devices, same is true in big pharma, most of it used to be funded by government. Now, the vast majority is funded by the industry themselves. So you can imagine how much control that is taken away from the government doing due diligence on a particular product and the clinical studies involved versus what the industry, who has a vested interest in making it successful, does to manipulate studies and results from those studies. There was a woman in this documentary, several actually, who were talking about the clinical study for Assure, the birth control product. I'll just go ahead and talk about that now. And they were talking about how when they came back to they only did the study. It was a very small group of people, and it was over a relatively short period of time. You're talking about permanent birth control. These coils that were inserted into your fallopian tubes were intended, the whole idea was they'll produce an inflammatory response. We know what inflammation does in the body, you guys. And the inflammatory response would basically close up your fallopian tubes because it would produce so much scar tissue. And a woman who participated in these trials said, several women actually were talking about how they were coached on their answers. So for example, like, can you feel it? And one woman was like, well, I have a sharp pain in my abdomen. And they were like, but like, can you actually feel like the coils themselves? No. Okay. How satisfied are you with this product? And, if they would try to say, I'm not very satisfied at all, like I have these other issues, some women were saying, I was coached, well, you haven't gotten pregnant, right? So it's done its job. Okay, yeah, very satisfied in that regard, I guess. And then literally how they went through, and some women asked, they were like, why did you could see how they marked off their answers and changed them to different answers and kind of initialed it and dated it, that they had changed the answer. And women, when they asked about it, were told this is customary in clinical trials. Like, we change your answers so that they're, more accurate for, what we're going for in our study. Yeah, so that's the really intricate scientific clinical trial process in one context as described by some of these people. So, on that note, Assure, along with a whopping 98% of medical devices, do not go through pre-market approval, which means they are not trialed in the kind of conventional way where there are these long-term large human studies. There was a loophole created a long time ago, and they interview in this documentary a former FDA commissioner, I think one of the very, very few who hasn't come from industry and gone to work for industry and kind of stayed in the revolving door. He seemed like a pretty honest, forthcoming guy. He was the only person, former or current FDA, who was willing to sit down for this documentary. So not only, it's kind of customary for the industry that they're criticizing to not sit down, but pretty shocking that the FDA was not willing to sit down when the FDA is supposed to be like our advocate, right? Who are they actually working for? But anyways, this former FDA commissioner sat down and he said, yes, this loophole was created. It's called the 510K process. And it was created to be an exception, and it has very quickly turned into the rule. So rather than going through pre-market approval, if a company can say this device is very similar essentially to a previous device, then they don't have to do the pre-market approval process. They just need like a little trial to kind of like demonstrate, if that, I don't even know. I'll have to look into that again. I don't know to what extent they even need new trials or safety studies. But the point is, there's this loophole where industry can say my device is similar enough to a previous product, and it becomes this like web of like layer upon layer of the lack of studies. So a device can be based on a previous device that also was based on a previous device that also was based on a previous device. And so if these devices are similar enough to each other and just kind of go up the chain, we can just continue to quote unquote innovate without doing more safety studies. So for example, metal on plastic hip replacements, metal on metal is similar enough to that. Therefore, we can get it approved quickly through the 510K process through the FDA because it's similar enough. No, mind you, that safety studies haven't been done about how this metal on metal could potentially, leak into your system and impact your brain and poison you. So that's just kind of an example. Also, in the 510K process, there is no mechanism for like accounting for what if devices down that chain that your new device is based off of and going through the 510K process and justified. What if that product down the line was pulled off the market because it was deemed unsafe or ineffective? Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So if I have a medical device and it was based on a medical device, it's drastically similar to a medical device that has been pulled off the market because it's so bad, I can still go through it still qualifies for the 510K approval process. It's vastly similar to a product that didn't work and was dangerous. Therefore, I can get it approved by the FDA. What kind of madness is that? So, and I talked about what clinical trials really look like. So Assure, let me tell you a little bit more about this, the stories of these women. So it's supposed to be permanent birth control. Not only, so several of these women, and I'm talking about in the tens of thousands, were having autoimmune disorders stem from the inflammation it caused. They would have devices that were misplaced and went into their uterus. Some of these women had like 8 to 10 of these devices when they were supposed to have 2, because it turned out that, the sales reps would be in the room coaching these doctors. And when they would kind of slip, like misfire on one, they would say, oh, it's okay, just insert another one. And then when these women would try to get it removed, particles would stay in their body forever, permanently, that could not be removed. So you can imagine the issues that this has caused. Women who have literally had their sex lives taken away forever. Women who have had to have total hysterectomies in their 20s. Women who, and I know that there are adverse kind of complications that can happen from any procedure, from any drug, from any product. Even the safest of the safe is bound to happen. But this one was pretty, in the tens of thousands of adverse events. And how what was the response that they got? Well, it turns out that in our lovely country, there is not a great mechanism for reporting adverse events. So, and you'll have to forgive me if any of this sounds familiar to today. But in this documentary, they talked about how the best studies we have on what ends up getting reported to this self-reporting system is about 5%. That's the best estimate. And on top of that, that the most serious adverse events are actually less likely to be reported to the adverse event reporting system than the less severe events for whatever reason. So these women were advocating and advocating and advocating. They were meeting with Congress people. They were trying to do something that obviously, like petitioning these drug companies, petitioning the FDA to get it taken off the market. They ended up finding and paying for a video recording of the FDA approval meeting where this Assure birth control got approved. And that was pretty shocking in and of itself. This approval panel had open-ended questions that Bayer could not answer about potential safety hazards and concerns, and they rubber stamped it anyway and approved it anyway. And they joked at the end and said, "Oh yeah, like what? Like the question was posed, like, what are we gonna do if this turns out to be like dangerous or doesn't work?" And they were like, "Well, everybody's gonna like hunt us down individually and make us answer to that." And they all laughed and it got approved. And imagine watching that as a woman who had to have your insides taken out in your 20s and live with chronic headaches and inflammation and other like medical issues. Or imagine, a lot of these women, it turned out to actually fail at being a birth control method. So the benefits were overstated. They kept increasing like the percentage of effectiveness that they promised. It went from like 98.45% to people were suddenly saying 99.95% effective. Well, it turns out thousands of women had babies or got pregnant, I should say, and many of them, disproportionate to the general population, suffered horrific miscarriages. Many of them had babies that were born with health complications. So this device really sucked. And there's a piece in the documentary, a little segment where they actually go to, it's a conference for, I believe, for OBGYNs. And they're outside kind of staging a demonstration, holding up signs. They're trying to talk to physicians as they're coming out. And the physicians they talk to, it's like gut wrenching how dismissed they were and how gaslit they were. The attitude and the literal language of some of these physicians was like, "You're not a doctor, you're speaking in nonsense, this is safe and effective." And these women were like, "No, I'm telling you, like, I've got over 35,000 women in our advocacy group working on this, and with over 9,000 surgeries between us from complications from this. What do you say?" And he's like, "Well, there are complications with anything." And they just go in, unfortunately, into the category of people who have had complications. And and these women are saying, "Well, what do you do if it needs to be taken out?" "Oh, you just pull it out." "No, you can't do that. It leaves fragments in people." And this guy's like, "Come on, you're talking crazy." Because this Assure had been on the market for over a decade. It was about 15 years at this point. It took 2 more years to get it off the market. So these doctors are sitting here in front of these women, like, "You're, no, it's safe and effective. Like, sorry, you had a bad experience, but this is safe and effective, and I know what I'm doing." Many of this women, I also thought it was interesting to me that some of these women only were able to tie their sudden onset of an autoimmune disorder or their sudden pain or issues to Assure much later. So some of these women, talk about going in to see their physicians, and they're like, "It can't be the Assure. It's some kind of autoimmune response that was activated by something. Who knows?" So does that also sound familiar? I was just struck by how, obviously there are cases where, women get mesh, vaginal mesh put in, and then later that day literally go to the bathroom and their intestines fall out of them. Those are pretty obviously complications from the vaginal mesh. In many, many other cases, though, it isn't that screamingly obvious. And so many women described going into their physician and being told, like, it's in your head, or this happens with sometimes disproportionately with your demographic, your race or ethnicity is more prone to these kinds of issues, or it's just you're getting older. anything but the intervention that they just performed. So I was just personally struck by that it's really hard to be taken seriously by anybody. And it's really hard to tie some of these adverse events to a particular medical intervention, whether that be a device or a drug. And so that to me demonstrates that much more how we need a robust approval process and clinical trials process and transparency into what that process looks like and what the actual results are, not the ones as manipulated by industry and fed to the FDA and fed to physicians that then get fed to patients to sell their product. Because let's remember, industry is concerned with what? Quarterly earnings. They need to sell their product, period. And they'll do whatever it takes to sell their product. Because remember, they've got a few acorns stashed away for a rainy day when they get sued, and they're still making bank. So who else? They're not going to do it. Who else is going to do it? So that brings us to the FDA, looping back around to the FDA. So there's an interview at one point in this documentary with an FDA scientist, a former FDA scientist, who was asked to look at an MRI machine. A CT scanner machine. And he's, taking a look at it, and he ends up suggesting, because they're dealing at the time with overdoses on radiation, people are getting stomach cancer from this machine being overused. Bear in mind, it's a very, very profitable machine. CT scans are very profitable for doctors and clinics and radiology clinics. And so ultimately profitable for industry. And so he's saying, this has the risk of being overused, and people, especially if they're exposed to this multiple times, they're getting cancer. And some people, are dying from too much radiation. So he suggested something very simple. He said, let's put an FDA warning label on the machines themselves so that doctors and therefore patients will know, basically to use a moderation that this can increase your risk of exposure to radiation, and high amounts can increase your risk of stomach cancer. It seems like a pretty benign, simple, no-brainer recommendation. Well, their response was he just got tremendous pushback, and it didn't happen. And he said that he was like, look, I worked with really great people who were really interested in public health and safety. And a group of him and 9 other scientists ended up having a meeting with the commissioner at the time and bringing their safety concerns and saying, look, we're suggesting these basic things and it's not being heard or taken seriously. And they kind of laid out all of their different safety concerns specifically with him. And the response was, and this has been proven since then by a congressional investigation, but those 9 scientists all got spyware immediately put on their devices, where there were screenshots of their screens taken every 2 seconds and their keystrokes were monitored. And within 1 year, every single one of those 9 scientists who raised health and safety concerns was either fired or let go. So if you want a career advocating for public health and safety, the FDA might not be like a rosy career path for you. It might not be the right career path, according to the scientist at least. So what else happens at the FDA? Well, I mentioned the one FDA commissioner who was on camera talking about these things pretty openly. He would be an exception. But almost every single, especially in the last couple of decades, FDA commissioner has come from and gone to industry. So it's this revolving door. And listen, I think there's benefit to being familiar with an industry if you're going to be the FDA commissioner. I'm not discounting that. I do think that there's a point that maybe the door should swing one way and not the other. How are they allowed to be in this revolving door where, they work for industry? Our latest FDA commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, who was nominated by Trump, by the way, he worked for the company that funded the research for Assure. He brought that to market. And he then went on to work for the FDA. And now what is he? He is a board member, one of the 9 in charge of health and safety and regulation at Pfizer. He is a board member at Pfizer and has a serious vested financial interest in Pfizer's products being brought to market successfully and being adopted by the public successfully. So Scott Gottlieb is before we kind of go further down that path, this is not unusual. So this happens all the time in the FDA, that the commissioner is left with a really cushy job in big pharma or medical device, or something in that industry. But before we jump to Scott Gottlieb and the Twitter files, there is this false idea that I just want to hammer home, that our FDA and our regulatory agencies and our government have like a mechanism in place that is seamless in taking something off the market that is dangerous, and it is too risky, where the risks outweigh the benefits. Yeah, and I think that's really what I want to say about that, is no one's doing a true risk benefit analysis for you. The part that I wanted to touch on with physicians, because I like to be careful about what I say about physicians, because I have met so many, I know so many, and I know that physicians, scientists, people who got into this field in the first place are really trying to do great work. I had the perception, I'll just give you a very real life example. After I had my first baby, went in for, my OB recommended an IUD. And so I said, okay, cool. And I remember he actually, and he was great. And he was actually like, I have a pamphlet on it if you want to go home and read about it. And I remember thinking, like, why would I want to read about it? Like, if you're my doctor and you're telling me I should get it, then that means I should get it. I really took for granted how cool it was that he encouraged me to do research. Now, I didn't. I had in my mind, like, IUDs are great. Like, they work really great. Women love them. I hadn't like spoken at that time to many women who love them, but I heard that women love them. It was only after I had a terrible experience, and in 3 weeks, I was experiencing a lot of pain, a lot of different issues. And I started like asking around, and just happened, like I was at book club, and one of my friends was like, oh yeah, I had the same issue. Like, I hated it. A friend of mine in Texas, she was asking me about it, and she had a similar experience. And I was like, that's so weird that I'm pretty sure women love this thing and that it's awesome, but the ones I'm actually talking to, and maybe it's because I had issues with it, so I was, more attuned than to people who had issues with it. But long story short, I went in to my doctor, and I called them. I was messaging with the nurses, and everybody told me, it'll go away. Just hang in there. It'll go away eventually. And I just had this like gut feeling. I was just like, I hate this. I didn't just carry a baby for 9 months and then go through postpartum only to have to continue to rail on my body more. No, thank you. I'm opting out of this. And so I scheduled an appointment, went in to get it removed, and still 2 doctors came in, and they were really nice, but they encouraged me to keep it in and just kind of wait it out. And I made probably one of the most empowered statements I've ever made in front of a medical expert in my life, because normally I'm nodding my head and just complying with anything they tell me, because I was just raised to trust them, and take them at their word, and assume that, and you can take them at their word oftentimes, but to assume that they know everything about what they're recommending to you is not exactly true in all cases. So they encouraged me to keep it in, and I said, listen, I can't give you a justifiable reason. I just know that I want this thing out of my body. And they said, okay, cool. And they got it out, and then I was good. So I had no more issues. And so it just highlights to me, because I'm thinking back on past experiences, and I'm like, now knowing more how this works. So here's what's truly happening with physicians. Physicians work so hard, and especially if they're in the insurance model where they're accepting insurance, they have to really turn over patients really, really fast to make a profit. They have these medical device reps and these big pharma reps coming in to sell them stuff. And most doctors are great. You hear stories about like some doctors recommending whatever stuff, sales reps are like, if this sales rep from this pharma company is doing more for me, quote unquote, if he's giving me more gifts, because these sales reps, you guys spend millions of dollars every year on schmoozing physicians. That's on opensecrets.org or .com, I forget, but they're selling to these physicians. They want them like, use my medical device, prescribe my medication. And these doctors are privy to whatever, they're not looking at the primary data in a lot of cases. we know that because what data are they getting? They're getting whatever data the industry wants them to get. That's what they're getting. And they're trusting, just like we are as patients, that, well, the FDA did its due diligence. In my mind, too, I'm like that. Physicians should be able to trust that the FDA did their due diligence on whatever product this is that they're pushing. If the FDA says it's safe and effective, then physicians are going to believe it's safe and effective, and patients are going to believe it's safe and effective. When you start to peek behind the curtain, my point is there are practical ways you can do your research. It's not going to be perfect, but ultimately go with your gut and make a decision. But before I ever swallow a pill, before I ever take an injection, before I ever get a device implanted into my body, you best believe that while I'm talking with my trusted physician, I am also going to take some responsibility myself and look into what the approval process was, who funded the research, what was the extent of the clinical trials, what came out, like how good is that, how much transparency is there, or how much transparency is there not? Like, are all of the quote unquote studies and clinical trials we have from the company themselves? If so, I'm going to take it with a smaller grain of salt than I would if there are larger independent studies, or if it's peer reviewed. So those are just things I would suggest considering that I consider myself. I also personally go and look in the adverse event reporting system because I'm like, if it's safe to assume that about 5% of adverse events are reported, if that's the best data we have, then I personally, I'm not suggesting that this is true or that you should do it, but I'm going to go into the adverse event reporting system and assume that that number is much greater, just to be safe. Because like I said, when it comes to my own personal health, I'm not talking about projecting that out on the health of others, but when it comes to my own personal medical decisions, I think a little skepticism is going to serve me well, ultimately. That's just my personal opinion. So Scott Gottlieb and how that relates to the Twitter files really quickly as we close. So Alex Berenson, whom I've talked about on this podcast, if you remember, he has separately, before the Twitter files were ever a thing, he was like the prequel to the Twitter files, right? Because he sued Twitter over being censored and proved in the discovery process that it was at the behest of individuals in government positions. And also Scott Gottlieb came up. He is known, by the way, if you look at him, he's like an analyst on CNBC. And they introduce him as former FDA commissioner, Scott Gottlieb. They don't introduce him as current Pfizer board member and somebody with millions and millions of dollars of interest in this company being successful, Scott Gottlieb. No, it's former FDA commissioner, because that gives him credibility. That makes him look like he is objective when he's coming on CNBC and telling us what we should think about healthcare and pharmaceuticals and all of this stuff going on. So that cracks me up. So Scott Gottlieb, in these documents that were produced in Discovery, Alex Berenson was suddenly privy to seeing like a peek behind the curtain of how his stuff got censored and how he ultimately got banned from Twitter. And Scott Gottlieb was somebody who was really vocal, pushing for Alex Berenson specifically to be taken off Twitter. And the way he positioned it at the time was, I'm not concerned about healthy debate. I think that that's good, and opinions and debate are good. I'm concerned about, and I'm paraphrasing obviously and doing my best Scott Gottlieb impression, but Scott Gottlieb, when those Discovery documents came out, he was like, I'm just concerned about something that could incite violence against, a people who believe differently or whatever. So he was concerned about Alex Berenson talking about the COVID-19 pandemic and vaccines. Even though it was accurate, he was concerned that it would incite violence. That was his spiel at the time. Well, as it turns out, now we have more information from the Twitter files and more examples. Let me just pull them up right here. So Scott Gottlieb secretly pressed Twitter to hide posts challenging his company's massively profitable schmovid jabs. So we're looking right here in 2021 in August. This was a tweet from Dr. Guiar, however you pronounce his name. Here's what he tweeted, just for context. He said, "It's now clear that COVID-19 natural immunity is superior to vaccine immunity by a lot. There's no scientific justification for vax proof if a person had prior infection. CDC Director POTUS must follow the science. If no previous infection, get vaccinated." Mr. Gottlieb emails his friends at Twitter, this is the kind of stuff that's corrosive. He draws a sweeping conclusion off a single retrospective study in Israel that hasn't been peer reviewed, but this tweet will end up going viral and driving news coverage. So Twitter says there's nothing here that violates our policies, but we're going to slap a misleading label on it anyway so that it can't be shared. A week later, Gottlieb complained again to Twitter about, and by the way, when these complaints from Gottlieb are passed along, they're passed along as former FDA commissioner said blah, blah, blah. Not current Pfizer stakeholder, massive stakeholder who needs this product to be successful. But anyway, a week later, he complained again about a tweet from Justin Hart. Here's what that tweet said. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but a viral pathogen with a child mortality rate of approximately 0 has cost our children nearly 3 years of schooling. So he's not even talking about efficacy. He's talking here about the facts, which were that child mortality rate is about 0, and our children have missed 3 years of schooling over this. So why did Gottlieb object to that one? I'm not sure, but it is important to, I'm just observing what was happening during that time. Let's see. Well, they were weeks away. Pfizer was weeks away from getting the shots approved for children age 5 to 11. So there's that. I also personally think that in order for a product to be successful and to increase demand, you not only have to make people believe that one, their children need it for their health, but also remember the environment that we were in where it's like, we want to go back to school, we want to go back to work, we want to get back to normal life. And that you have to make people believe that this is a solution in the way to getting out of lockdown from your home, in my personal opinion. And around that same time was when Gottlieb was pressing Twitter to act against Alex Berenson specifically. So, and at the time, he said this is the inability of these platforms to police direct threats, physical threats about people. That's my concern about what's going on in that ecosystem. So he was like on CNBC and all over Twitter saying, I'm unconcerned about debates being made, quote, I'm concerned about physical threats being made for people's safety. So, but yet here you have, now we're seeing that at the same time he was pressing Twitter to stifle, like fully throttle tweets about and posters about natural immunity, about school closures. What the F? So this would not be the first time that Pfizer has violated rules. Just as a quick reminder, back in 2009, it agreed to pay $2.3 billion for fraudulently marketing several drugs. Back in 96, it conducted a clinical trial of an antibiotic in Nigeria that killed 11 children. And yet this is the company that now is saying, promise you guys, we're being honest this time. And let me check. Yep. CDC statement has not changed since these mRNA vaccines were first introduced. The CDC recommendation is to get it, basically. The CDC says that vaccines are safe and effective. Specifically the mRNA COVID vaccines are safe and effective. Still, that blanket statement has not changed. So I have to say it here that according to the CDC, it is safe and effective. So everybody should get a few. Is Pfizer suddenly telling us the truth about their products? Maybe. It's possible. Their track records would suggest otherwise to me personally. But hopefully this has given you a little sense of, what's behind the curtain and kind of the processes that, in this case, medical devices specifically go through. And I think, the more information we can have about how this stuff actually works and where the conflicts of interest are for certain major actors who wield a lot of power over our health, I think it's beneficial for us to understand how these things work. There's not necessarily, a one-to-one relationship, just because Pfizer marketed fraudulently many, many drugs in 2009 doesn't mean that a Pfizer drug today is going to hurt me. That's not what I'm saying. I just think it's important to understand historical context, the track record of these companies and regulatory agencies, and be empowered with that information to make better decisions and not just take a shiny new object right here, right now, at the company's word. All right. Thanks for joining me today. Fingers crossed this stays up on YouTube.